that I will suggest some books and further reading for you if you're interested in the subject. But I just want to give a quick disclaimer at the beginning, which is that the history of LSD and the influence and legacy of LSD is a really vast one. It's huge, and it's one that touches on every element of the political, social, cultural, and economic changes, I would say, of the last 50 years. With that being said, I thought tonight I wanted to focus on one particular element of LSD and one particular element of its history. So that element is about politics, and particularly about the 1960s and 70s and how LSD sort of crashed into a political situation that was already turbulent. And I want to show you a couple ideas of the types of things that people were thinking, the types of ideas that they brought into the movement, and how it really changed the whole thing. So I'm going to share my screen really quickly. Oh, that's perfect. I'm the co-host now, so I can do this. Let's see. I have lots of images for you, so I'm going to be a lot smaller, and you can hear my voice. But I do want to say, I'm going to have the chat up. So if you have ideas or questions or thoughts that you want to pop into the chat, hopefully I can take a look at them and integrate them into what we're saying here and address some of your questions and ideas. So this is my book, just to start off, and I don't bring it up just to say go buy my book. I'm more saying that I wrote this book, Dangerous Grounds: Anti-War Coffee Houses and Military Dissent in the Vietnam Era. This was my dissertation. This was what I was working on for years at the CUNY Graduate Center in New York City. And it was this book was the kind of end point of where I had started in graduate school, which was trying to investigate the topic of the counterculture and how the counterculture had an effect on politics. So the intersection of culture and politics. But in particular, when I first started in graduate school, I was really interested in this acid question. I really, for me, I grew up with images of the 1960s. I grew up with images of, a lot of turbulence around the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement. And I wasn't sure sort of how that story would have been affected by this drug LSD, which I had heard about in, this mysterious way. Because by the time I learned about LSD, it had been illegal for many decades. So I want to think about sort of the influence of this drug on a particular scene. So this will be a small story, I think, within the larger story of LSD, but I hope that the small story connects to the sorts of things that we're talking about now, and the sort of your wider understanding of the 60s and 70s. So I don't know if anyone knows who this man is. It sort of looks like an unlikely figure to start a story about sex, drugs, and rock and roll and the counterculture in the 60s. But that's Albert Hofmann. He's a Swiss chemist. He's the person who really stumbled upon LSD-25 as he was working at Sandow's Chemicals, and really, a chemical company where he is making all sorts of chemicals that are going to be used for all sorts of pharmaceutical uses, household chemicals, all sorts of things. But what he ends up discovering and getting a little bit of LSD-25 on his fingers, which is lysergic diethylamide, that he has some sort of psychological effect. He remembers that psychological effect because it was very light, and he remembers it years later. And years later, he decides to return to LSD-25 in 1943. And in 1943, Hofmann ingests a large dose of LSD. And this is what we would say is the first acid trip. And this is a really legendary moment. It's referred to as Bicycle Day because Hofmann left his laboratory. And when he left his laboratory, that's actually a sheet of acid, blotter acid, that later on that used this logo. And a blotter acid, for those that don't know, blotter acid is acid that's paper that's been soaked with LSD, and then each little bit is the individual dose. Either way, Hofmann has a very interesting science fiction like bicycle trip, and that bicycle trip shows him something about this drug, shows him particularly that this drug seems to provide some sort of experience that alters consciousness, and not only alters consciousness a little bit, but alters consciousness a lot. So, there's actually a really great graphic novel by Brian Blommerth called Bicycle Day, which is exactly like it looks like, a visual history of the world's first acid trip. And it has like these really cool sort of visual depictions based on Hoffman's description of what he saw on the way home from the laboratory. So, he had this kind of multi-dimensional psychedelic, what would be called a psychedelic trip. Again, there was no language for any of this. And in fact, that language is going to come later as we kind of enter acid into popular culture. But at this point, it's a pharmaceutical drug and a psychiatric drug. And as time goes on, there's another great shot from Bicycle Day. As time goes on, you start to get interest in LSD from the medical community, particularly the psychiatric community. And you go through a period in the late 1940s and into the 1950s in which LSD is going to be used in a psychiatric setting. In the West, a lot of people in the United States are going to take acid trips while they're laying on the psychiatrist's couch or laying on their therapist's couch. And that experience of kind of an observed acid trip in a chemical setting or in a laboratory setting is going to be something that a lot of people experience in the 1950s and into the 1960s, when the US government starts getting interested in LSD experimentation as well. And I'm not going to tell the whole story of MK Ultra and the CIA and their experiments of how you could use this. But I think the main thing I wanted to get out of here is that LSD was immediately seen as a really powerful drug, but one that institutions weren't sure how to use it, what it could be used for. The CIA wanted to use it for interrogation. They thought it might have some uses in as like a truth serum or something like that. And they're going to do all sorts of wacky experiments, and you can read books about that. But what I kind of wanted to see how this is going to crash into mass culture and how this is going to crash into a political situation in the United States that has a very particular kind of tone to it, and what's going to happen when acid comes in there. The 1950s psychiatric LSD phenomenon is pretty interesting. Cary Grant is probably one of the most famous celebrities that took LSD and spoke of it positively. I think he took many LSD trips on the psychiatrist's couch throughout the 1950s. He credited LSD with a couple different things. I mean, it changed his life, and he spoke about it very positively. But the main things he said is that it cured him of his alcoholism and cured him of negative attitudes about women. So those ideas that Cary Grant, he didn't become like a long-haired hippie. He instead, within the context of the 1950s, he's having some sort of experience that's showing him, the errors of his way. And all I mean to say by that is that psychiatrists saw it as a tool, and they saw it as a tool through which people could examine their own minds. And that's in fact, the word psychedelic is going to be mean actually mind manifesting or mind making. Psychedelic meaning you're kind of creating the mind that you can examine. So LSD in the 50s has this kind of psychiatric buzz, and that's going to lead to a couple of men at Harvard who are going to see the possibilities of this. These two are Harvard professors. That's Timothy Leary on the left and Richard Alpert on the right. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on Timothy Leary just because he's the kind of standard figure that we usually hear this story about, because he was one of the people who's going to capture the attention of the mass media. And he's actually going to be seen by many, and he's going to embrace the role as a sort of leader of the acid revolution. Leary is a character that many people see as a hero in the story. Leary is also a character that many people see as a villain in the story. I would say, since I'm a historian, I'm not going to call him hero or villain, but just say that he's a complicated figure. And he's one that Leary especially is someone that is going to be sort of the face of LSD for a lot of Americans. And that's going to kind of go through this era, which I think, to the era that I want to talk about the most today is kind of 66 to 69. But this is this is the kind of the beginnings of this, and you can see how much this is going to change, because Timothy Leary there's Timothy Leary in 1969. He looks different. He looks stoned, but he also looks, he's embracing the counterculture. His hair is longer. He's wearing rings on his fingers. He's kind of become that hippie Leary. And for his part, Richard Alpert, who just recently passed away, he changed his name and he became a figure named Ram Dass. And Ram Dass is someone who, was an acid proselytizer ultimately at the beginning, but Alpert becomes someone who's very much interested in meditation, Eastern religion, and there's actually quite a bit of that going on. So there's something to be said about like white men discovering a sort of mysticism that they felt was lacking. And that's a whole theoretical place to go when you're thinking about American history and Western history, because it goes all the way back to, fascination with Native American shamanic rituals and all that stuff. And in fact, Leary was that person. I mean, Leary was the person that was experimenting with mushrooms. There was a lot of attention towards specifically Mexican tribes in the 1950s that were using psychedelic mushrooms. So he was sort of primed for this escape. But ultimately what happens to Timothy Leary is he begins experimenting with LSD. He begins experimenting with it in a sort of non-academic way. So this is off campus. He's starting to meet with, students, but more than graduate students. He's really sharing the LSD experience with people who he thinks can unpack it and tell him what it means. So he's bringing on writers and artists and thinkers and political people because he sees the potential for this to be a world-changing technology. And I think that's a key part of Leary's project is once he internalizes the acid experience, it turns him away from the values of academia. He begins to see that, he's using the words that are, very kind of common 60s words to describe his life as a professor, as a robot life in a capitalist order that he no longer could make sense of, and that he wanted to move beyond. And he felt that it's something that could actually help decondition Americans and decondition human beings away from the values that had put the world into the Cold War and had put the world into a place where we're now, civil rights movement is happening in the early 60s. We're heading towards Vietnam, nuclear war and the Cuban Missile Crisis are happening in 1962. Nuclear war didn't happen, but it was, nuclear war is kind of hanging over the age. So it's a really sort of apocalyptic moment. And Ram Dass and Timothy Leary are sort of seeing the potential for a split in consciousness that can move people beyond these structures. So, there's a lot to that, but, other figures, and I know there's a lot of dudes to this. I mean, this is part of this era of political action is you're going to see a lot of leaders emerge that are a lot of male leaders, but I want to interrogate that as well. But you can just see the change. I mean, Allen Ginsberg, right? He's a counterculture sort of, beat poet. This is Allen Ginsberg in the 1950s when he wrote Howl and was the sort of, voice of a generation of outcasts. By the 1960s, Ginsberg looks different. He's become a sort of proselytizer of LSD and marijuana. And he's really about synthesizing the world of poetry and art and music and drugs and sex and synthesizing that with the sort of capitalist reality that he saw as so destructive. So Ginsberg is a really important figure, and we're going to come back to Ginsberg as well. Another important figure, and this will get us to the kind of setting of where a lot of this action is going to take place, is Ken Kesey. So Ken Kesey is an author. You may know the book, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Kesey is someone who is going to be dosed by LSD by the U.S. government. I think he was at Stanford, but at one of the universities near the Bay Area. Kesey, you can actually go on YouTube. I won't play it for you because it's a little long, but you can actually watch and listen to the recording of Kesey's acid trip and what it did to him. He came out of those experiments a different person, and he began sort of collecting experiences and collecting people that were interested in the LSD experience. And that leads to the creation of a group of people that are going to be called the Merry Pranksters. And I really think of them as, leading towards what we're going to call hippie. So this is happening in the Bay Area, and this bus that that they create, with its kind of day glow colors and wild costumes that the people are wearing. No one else looked like this in 1965, and that's where I want to date this. 1965, you're still a very straight-laced conservative culture in a lot of ways, and this stands out. So this, I think a kind of an interesting way of thinking about this is Kesey, while they were driving across the country, all sort of, basically doing drugs and recording, doing a lot of like recording video and audio and doing a lot of like, media projects, I would say, and that's gonna sort of bleed into our age as well. But they get pulled over by the cops a lot. And when they get pulled over, they said, nothing ever happened because we just explained to the police that we were theater people and we were on the way to our next show. And the police had no idea who they were. In other words, within a year, every police officer in America is going to know what this is. They're going to associate this with drugs. They're going to associate this with the counterculture. But in 1965, Kesey is able to, travel around like this because the world hasn't caught up yet. The world hasn't caught up to what they're really doing. So you can see a little bit of the Merry Pranksters in their rituals. This is these are freaks. These are weirdos, and that word freak is going to be actually a word that many of the acid people are going to embrace as a sort of something to be proud of. That they are different, they are outsiders, and that outcast thing, it has a longer history. This is like I brought up Ginsburg in part to kind of touch on the idea that we're coming from the beatnik beat era in which there was already a sort of marijuana-driven counterculture, certainly in San Francisco in the North Beach area. But as you progress, you start to have this day glow acid culture, and it's going to develop rather quickly. What Kesey and others are going to do in Berkeley and in San Francisco and in Oakland are a number of parties. And these parties are called the acid test, and they're really meant to, bring people together in an environment in which they have to endure the psychedelic experience. And that part of it, you can see this you can already see the sort of visual elements of psychedelia starting to come out here. But at these acid tests, they had basically like, high school gymnasiums with lights being projected all over the place, rock music. Music was a huge part of this, and really a sense that there was a new culture being born. So in a lot of ways, this is just about young people discovering a sort of, alternative culture. But at the same time, it's going to emerge from writers and political people who have a real sort of sense that what they're doing is not just about partying, that they want to sort of shift consciousness. And we're going to see a little bit of that in a second. So this is one of my favorite images from the acid test graduation, in which, this is the drug culture emerging, but you're going to see it take a particular shape because of where it's happening. So I've mentioned this already, but there are two things going on when you think of the 1960s in terms of politics. I mean, there's a lot more than two, but in general, you can think of the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement as taking up a lot of energy politically, and you can have the civil rights issue and race taking up a lot of the energy. And those issues, the anti-war movement and the issue for the kind of fight for racial equality, which is sort of never ending in American history, they're gonna sort of, have a rough interaction. And there's a lot of different paths that are going to be kind of suggested along the way. But one of them is this counterculture that's going to be present in San Francisco, in Berkeley, in Oakland, in the Bay Area in California, while other events are sort of transpiring, and that's why it's gonna be important. Tom Wolfe wrote a very famous book about the acid test called the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. It's Tom Wolfe. So if you're a Tom Wolfe fan, the writing is fantastic. It's a really, it's a weird book and it's a weird take on all this stuff. And Wolfe obviously has his own sort of tongue-in-cheek anthropological take on the hippies. But it's sort of the classic text of this kind of early period in which psychedelia is starting to take shape. And it's starting to take a shape in which people are having experiences that are social, they're recreational, but we're going to see how it affects the politics. So at some point in 1966, you have the mainstream media is going to start reporting on LSD and LSD as a social phenomenon. So this is the only reason this is going to happen is because there's going to be a rising hysteria about young people taking this drug. So in other words, we went from it being a kind of controlled experimental drug within the kind of medical world to now it's being taken recreationally. And not only that, it's being taken recreationally by young people in the context of a really kind of radical alternative cultural expression and among people who are sort of identified as a part of a maybe connected to the left, maybe connected to some sort of political movement that's going on among young people. So this this Life magazine is great. If you open it up, it's got like a lot of pictures of young people looking very freaked out. There's one picture that's very memorable. Is a teenage girl sort of underneath a table in like a dirty apartment in the fetal position. It was a really negative article, and it sort of portrayed LSD as an incredibly mysterious and dangerous drug. And so, you know, that began a kind of a sort of concern about the legality of LSD. So we'll get to that in a minute as well. But in San Francisco, it began taking on a more sort of organized culture and a psychedelic culture that's going to pop up in 1965 and 1966 because of a number of different figures within San Francisco. And this is going to be, you know, in tension with what's happening on the campus of Berkeley, where Berkeley is filling up with students who are turning very radical. And I say that when I say radical, they're joining Students for a Democratic Society. They are demonstrating against the war. They're demonstrating against the administration at Berkeley. But if you've seen anything about like the Berkeley free speech movement in 1964, all the students are short hair. The boys are short hair and they're wearing shirts and ties. That's going to change really, really quickly. And the reason that's going to change is because there's a rising kind of hip counterculture, and San Francisco is going to be the place where this really takes off. There's a lot of reasons why San Francisco into, but I think the main one for us to understand is that of Victorian homes called the Haight-Ashbury that was kind of a rundown neighborhood that young people found that they could rent places very cheaply and could pack a lot of people into those houses. And the Haight-Ashbury ends up becoming a sort of ground zero for a psychedelic counterculture that by 1966 and 1967 is going to be visible on the streets of San Francisco and is even going to start spreading to other cities. So this is the San Francisco Oracle, created by a guy named Alan Cohen, who was interested in printing newspapers that sort of connected to youth culture. So the San Francisco Oracle they're stunning. They're hard to find. They're really big. These Oracle newspapers I'm showing you, I'm backing up. They're like this big. They're gigantic. They're amazing graphics and pictures. The Oracle is really cool. They all psychedelic news, psychedelic heroes on the cover. You can see inside what the San Francisco Oracle really looked like. What's funny about the Oracle, I read through a bunch of these when I was doing this research, and there's reviews of parties. That's one of the things I found that was funny. They reviewed parties. They would give it, that was a 3-star party because it didn't have, the music wasn't as good as the other ones. They really were interested in sort of tracking this sort of explosion of cultural activity, but it's also, very much a part of the peace movement. And you can see a sort of, a sort of kind of, an interaction between the peace movement and the counterculture. And there's one, the lead singer of Country Joe and the Fish is named Barry Melton. Country Joe and the Fish is a psychedelic rock band. And he described this very well later on, in this interaction between the sort of hip kids and the radicals, because the radicals are looking over at San Francisco and thinking, do we really want to join with this energy? Because these are like young dropouts, a lot of teenage runaways, people that are involved in the drug culture, is there a way to get together? So Barry Melton says this, and I quote him: "The politics of hip is that we were setting up a new world that was going to run parallel to the old world, but have as little to do with it as possible. We just weren't going to deal with straight people anymore. And to us, the politicos and a lot of the leaders in the anti-war movement were straight people because they were still concerned with the government. They're going to go march on Washington. We didn't even want to know that Washington was there. We thought that eventually the whole world was just going to stop all this nonsense and start loving each other as soon as they all got turned on." It's amazing that these two movements existed at the same time because they were often in stark contrast. So, you know, the notion that there's this split between people who are trying to change the world in some way and a sort of attitude about how to do that. And the radicals, the left radicals at Berkeley and in SDS are drawn to this culture. They're drawn to its energy, but at the same time, many of them are concerned that this will lead them out of their sort of political programs and lead them out of what they're really trying to do, which is, you know, end the war in Vietnam and create racial equality in the United States. That part of it is why there's going to be this kind of mix of politics in San Francisco and Berkeley and Oakland during this era. And there's a few other really important characters. Love that oracle. So the San Francisco Oracle, let's see, there we go, is also connected to the widespread manufacture and distribution of LSD. And this man on the left is more responsible, I think, for shifting and creating this explosion that happens in 1967. His name on the man on the left is named Augustus Owsley Stanley. Great name. I think it's actually Augustus Owsley Stanley III. And Owsley is a producer, a music man, a media guy. He works on recording equipment. He is the sound producer for the band The Grateful Dead. And that's Jerry Garcia, the lead singer and lead guitarist of The Grateful Dead on the right. Owsley, in addition to being the sound man and sound engineer for The Grateful Dead, is also a chemist. And he's going to manufacture what we now estimate to be more than 500 million doses of LSD over the course of 2 years, and distribute those hundreds of millions of tabs of acid, some of the purest LSD ever created, onto this. They're going to make their way onto the streets of the United States, mostly concentrated in the Bay Area in California. So this is, 66 and 67 is going to be heavy with acid because of this person and because of a few others that are creating this stuff. Owsley is a sort of mysterious figure. He's someone who is sort of legendary. People called it Owsley acid. And Owsley is a figure that I think is going to connect to, this whole scene that's happening among, people that are living on just a few blocks in the Haight. The Haight-Ashbury is going to explode. So what else is happening, and how does this connect to what's happening on the streets of San Francisco? Well, first of all, these are the San Francisco mime troupe. There's a tradition of guerrilla theater in San Francisco, men and women who put on performances that are meant to be sort of happenings. The San Francisco mime troupe put on all sorts of events that were meant to be sort of theatrical, sort of activist, they were wacky and weird, and they were early on. This is predating the mid 60s point. The San Francisco mime troupe is active in the 50s and early 60s. So the mime troupe and a number of figures within the mime troupe are going to kind of create. It's hard to describe what the diggers are, but they're going to create something called the San Francisco Diggers. And we know that these are 5 of the San Francisco Diggers. We know that there are a whole lot more people, including men and women, involved in this, but we don't really know many of their names. The Diggers are a group of, I guess you would call them activists, who are going to sort of take a lot of principles from psychedelia and the counterculture, and take a lot of ideas from political radicals, and try to create a fusion within the Haight-Ashbury. So what do the Diggers do, and where do they come from? Like I said, they're theatrical, so a lot of what they do is in public. They're going to do things like they're They're going to reenact things you couldn't do today. They're going to go to the Berkeley campus and reenact scenes from Vietnam, where they're going to literally be dressed in army uniforms and reenacting killing people in front of people. They did really often jarring and shocking events. And the Diggers, as they move on, through this history, the Diggers are sort of, going to be the movement on the streets of San Francisco that are attempting to put it all together, are attempting to sort of meld the worlds of radical politics and theater. So what do the Diggers do? I mean, one of the things they do is create the Digger Papers and the concept of free, or the free city. So they're all about really confronting the values of capitalism by creating institutions that are existing outside of capitalism. So if there's a hallmark to this period of psychedelic activity in the Haight, it's about creating and modeling the idea of people taking care of each other for free. And you're going to see a whole bunch of different experiments on that. I mean, there's a Digger free store in which they're essentially like a thrift store. People donate items, but they're not selling them. You can just go and pick what you need out of the Digger free store. There's actually going to be a free store in New York City as well that's going to sort of credit the Diggers for this idea. And it's really important to sort of understand the context of what's happening here. So that's the psychedelic shop, another psychedelic store in the Haight-Ashbury with people demonstrating against the police. The reason that's important, and the reason why I bring up the Diggers at this particular moment, is because the Diggers they're creating this idea that we don't have to protest, we can actually start building institutions for ourselves. This free store, free medical clinics, all sorts of different programs that were meant to sort of provide services to the public. This happens, and this was kind of one of the shocking things in my research. This happens in the context of racial unrest in San Francisco. So the riots of the 1960s get a lot of attention, obviously, and the ones, the big ones like the Watts riot in 1965, and we're not even really calling them riots anymore. We're calling them uprisings or rebellions, and I think that's the right term. But at the time, the hysteria was riots. So, you had Watts, you had Newark, you had Detroit in 1967. In September of 1966, there an uprising. Late September 1966 in San Francisco, in a neighborhood called Hunters Point, in which a police officer shot an unarmed Black teenager to death, and there was a rebellion among whites and Blacks on the streets of San Francisco that led to the National Guard being called, that led to the mayor declaring a state of emergency, that led to the governor being involved. And it was within this context, and this is what I discovered that kind of blew my mind, and it still does, thinking about it here, because I'm thinking about Seattle right now, and I'm thinking about Minneapolis and other places where these sort of free communities are happening literally right now in 2020, is those free communities emerged out of situations in which people were fighting the police, situations in which there was a powerful racial cast to what was happening. There was a racial rebellion, and the white radicals are sitting here, in the middle of the Haight-Ashbury in this kind of druggy counterculture. And what are they going to do? They are going to accelerate their programs of providing free services. So the Diggers opened their free store 3 days after Matthew Peanut Johnson, which was the name of the teenager who was killed. And Matthew Peanut Johnson, his name is going to appear on all of the Digger papers. And the Diggers are going to consciously and explicitly connect their program of creating free services for people within a city that need services to the larger problem of racial inequality and violence that's plaguing San Francisco. So they're very much announcing that the psychedelic counterculture is sort of, trying to join with or trying to certainly express the same types of values as the movement to overcome police violence among Black people in San Francisco. So it's a really key thing. because, you know, you see it in Occupy Wall Street, you see it in, like I mentioned, Seattle, this notion that we're going to create some sort of city within a city. And that city is going to run counter to all the values of the dominant institutions, and in fact is going to prove that we can take care of ourselves. It's kind of incredible to hear that language from protesters in New York City who are saying, cops, get out, we'll take care of ourselves, we'll create, I think the word today is mutual benefit. We're going to create institutions of mutual aid in which we help each other. And I'm not saying the diggers are inventing this idea, but the diggers are, it's very important that there are people who are sort of taking the psychedelic lessons of, like, you know, kind of breaking down boundaries. And it's the psychedelic ones, at least in the Haight-Ashbury, who are very much seeking an alliance, who are very much trying to convince everyone else, including the radicals in Berkeley, to be on their side. So, you know, that enters into this really kind of intense period, because it's in October of 1966. A lot happens in the fall of 1966. In October 1966, Bobby Seale and Huey Newton, who you see here, they start the Black Panther Party. And what's the Black Panther Party doing? If this is a month after the diggers start their free store, the Black Panther Party, you know, in addition to announcing themselves as defenders of the Black population against the police, literally with guns, which is definitely what got the most attention from the media, they also captured the attention of white radicals who are looking at the Black Panthers and thinking, we got to get with that. That is energy that's powerful. We want to be a part of that, but how do we be a part of that? We're white. Can we be white Panthers? And, you know, it enters into this really interesting period, because I think what you can see here is something that, you know, maybe is lacking from today's protest. Maybe it's not. I've just missed it. But there's a real sense of theatricality. And you can hear this from Bobby Seale today. You know, he talks about the Black Panthers, and he's like, we were attempting to, you know, essentially, you know, prank the media by, you know, putting on this image of, like, leather, black leather, getting guns, you know, wearing natural hair, wearing black berets, and really announcing ourselves as this kind of badasses. And they were totally conscious of the fact that they were playing the media. They're like, we got to get people's attention. And Bobby Seale is obviously very boisterous about that. He says, you know, these civil rights organizations, they were around for hundreds of years, but we were on the television immediately. We started and got the attention. And there was a price to pay for some of that. But one of the things that's extraordinary about the Black Panthers, particularly in this early iteration, is how much they're not really with the radicals in Berkeley. I would say, you know, ideologically, they're closer aligned to the diggers, closer aligned to this sort of more, you know, I guess if we're calling it politics, we'll say anarchist. You know, we're saying, you know, that they're trying to exist without a state here. But the free breakfast program, you know, the free breakfast program that the Black Panthers begin in Oakland is one of the most successful, if not the most successful, mutual aid program that's ever been. It still exists, and it's considered a really important part of Oakland's history, is that they're still giving free breakfast to any child in the city that needs it before school. So the Panthers start their free breakfast program. They start free medical clinics, you know, and they're really about sort of, again, taking the reins of the movement by creating institutions for themselves. All right, so, one more example, the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, another psychedelic warrior, David A. Smith, who I just read a book, where is it? Hold on, I'm gonna get it. Because this is an important one. Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s, by Tom O'Neill. Fantastic book. I guess I marked some things in it. I'll have to look. But Chaos is a book that just came out. It's, you know, part of a 20-year-long investigation. And this author connects David A. Smith and the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic to Charles Manson, who was in there during the late 60s, learning about the power of LSD. And Manson is going to be someone who uses LSD in much the same way as the CIA, which is as a deconditioning agent, as an agent of control. And you know, you can learn a lot about LSD as a drug that, you know, it has a lot of different applications and properties to it. But I think the main lesson is that it accelerates whatever is in your consciousness. So CIA agents are going to take LSD and they're going to have fantasies of, killing Fidel Castro with explosive cigars and all sorts of weird stuff like that. Whereas people in the Haight-Ashbury area, are going to take LSD and have a sort of colorful trip about love. I know it's very general, but there's a sense that LSD is a very sort of flexible experience, a variable experience. All of this leads to LSD being declared illegal in October of 1966. So that is after a lot of different expressions of concern, particularly from the U.S. government. The U.S. government holds a series of Senate subcommittee hearings in 1966 in which they're asking people to tell them about LSD and tell them if it's dangerous or not. Ultimately, a number of people, including Timothy Leary and Allen Ginsberg, are going to testify. And I just wanted to read a short bit from Allen Ginsberg's testimony in which he sort of frames this idea of LSD as something that should remain legal. And here's why. He says, "The mysterious LSD experience." This is again Ginsberg's testimony to the Senate in 1966. "The mysterious LSD experience has never been clearly explained to those closed off from the experience by the door of choice. It is not that mysterious. Here it is. Like Wordsworth's descriptions of natural unity, like the breakdown to complete personal self during sexual communion, like Tolstoy's dying soldier looking past Napoleon at the sky, like the strange world appearing after first loss of virginity, or like seeing a whole lifetime flash before drowning. These experiences natural to man, we have all glimpsed and pushed to the back of the mind. LSD brings this area of consciousness in front of us where we see it for 8 continuous hours. Such deep realization may be rejected by our mechanical society, sometimes with terror, but very few individuals are really unprepared to weather the stress of such deep self-knowledge. Therein lies the social riddle proposed by LSD. It can only be solved with tender legislation. Any tendency to bring police anxiety onto the scene will literally cause more traumatic damage to LSD users than the LSD itself. Models for sensible integration of psychedelic experience into the community are provided by American Indian peyote rituals. It will be 1984 science fiction space age nightmare unless the riddle is answered gently by all concerned. Gently. So, Ginsberg is very much, one of the more public figures in articulating something positive about LSD, something for him that's very, obviously a poetic experience, but one that he sees use for. And he sees use for especially in sort of breaking down the conditioning that is a major part of becoming socialized as a human being, and particularly an American. So, that part of it in October 66, LSD is made illegal. And what does that do? I mean, ultimately what that does, and why that's such an important thing, is because it almost gives a stamp of approval to LSD use for the counterculture. The fact that the U.S. government could say it's illegal and that we're now scheduling it as a Schedule I drug, which says that it has no use whatsoever, and that we're shutting down all experiments on it, and there will never be people in psychiatric settings that are going to be taking this anymore. So they really put an end on a certain era of exploration of LSD and turned it into a street drug, and turned it into something that became criminal and criminalized. And the result of that, for a period, is that it gave a sort of sense that we were doing something that made us outlaws, and that's going to lead to the Human Being, which takes place in January of 1967. So this is just a couple months after LSD is made illegal. And if you're in my Lebowski class, I think I mentioned the Human Being before, and I mentioned it then as a sort of, 60s, early like Coachella. This even looks like a rock concert poster, right? Where you're going to have thousands and thousands of people who are going to show up to a free concert, and they're going to listen to some of the psychedelic proselytizers. So, you know, at the Human Being, there's Leary and Ginsberg. You can see both of them there, and a few other figures. I'm not sure who they are, but this thing was huge. This thing was crowded. Like, more than 10,000 people showed up to this thing. And what's important about the Human Being is it was really an attempt by the people that organized it. And this is Alan Cohen, the San Francisco Oracle, the Grateful Dead, who are going to play at the thing. The people who organized it saw it as an opportunity to really display the positive values of the counterculture. One person described it as, we're going to have so much music and love and dancing that will end the war in Vietnam. And that, to me, is a really key line, as silly as that might sound to you. The idea that these folks saw their partying as revolutionary, as sort of saying to the war, we're going to turn our backs, and our expressions of joy are going to be they're going to be our protest. Our protest is us experiencing this ecstatic thing together. So the Human Being is a really important part of this, because it sort of, was an attempt to meld the radical world with the acid world. Now, who do you think won this particular day? I mean, I can tell you what happened. Augustus Owsley Stanley created tens of thousands of hits of special batch LSD for the Human Being. They distributed it at the Being, so there were people there at the gates giving blotter acid out to the people who were coming in. Basically, everybody at this place, and I'm talking 15,000 kids, took extremely powerful acid trip all together in one space. Not sure if this has happened before. I'm not sure what Coachella is like, but that's what happened there, right? Is this sort of drug party. By the afternoon, no one's paying attention anymore. There's sort of this is going on by the afternoon. And the radicals very famously, including, Jerry Rubin, who's sort of a half, radical, half counterculture guy, they're going to be standing up there and doing speeches about how we got to support the, SDS, and we got to move towards, ending the Vietnam War and things like that. And from all of the accounts, everyone says, that at a certain point, no one was listening to them anymore. It was just sort of like, if you can imagine, everyone talking to each other, partying amongst themselves. And, this is going to really head towards the whole Woodstock generation thing that happens a few years later. But the Human Being is different than Woodstock in the sense that it was an attempt to really meld these two worlds and say that this is political action. Counterculture activity is political. We're not the apolitical ones. So you have diggers that are part of this and part of the Human Being in '67. And the diggers are, they're sort of, in '67, during the Human Being, they're sort of, describing, and in the months after, they're sort of, taking their project and sort of accelerating it. And what they're saying is, effective protest, and this is from the diggers, is not in proclaiming the faults of the system, but in surviving independent of the system. That's why dropouts bring meaningful change, as they're creating a new community which the system cannot explain or assimilate. So you're starting to have a sort of counterculture ideology, to put it loosely, because counterculture people are going to hate ideology, but they're very much seeing the psychedelic experience as sort of the direction that humanity needs to go in. And here's another vision of that, in which the diggers, actually predating the Human Being, they had a funeral. They held a funeral for LSD, and they gave a sort of public event, October 6, 1966, when it was declared illegal. And this is their announcement of that event. They say, the first translation, and keep in mind, this is October 6th, so this is like the Hunters Point uprising. It just happened. This is happening in the context of National Guard occupying the city, a real sort of sense that we're fighting a revolution here. The diggers say, the first translation of the prophecy into political action will take place October 6, 1966. The date the California law prohibiting the possession of LSD comes into effect. The day of the fear-produced legislation against the expansion of consciousness. At 2 p.m. in the Panhandle at Oak and Masonic, We will gather and walk to the Park District Station to affirm our identity, community, and innocence from influence of the fear addiction of the general public as symbolized by this law. Copies of the prophecy of our Declaration of Independence, living morning glory plants, and mushrooms will be presented at 2:00 p.m. to San Francisco Mayor Shelley at City Hall, Cecil Poole, United States Attorney General for Northern California at the Federal Building, and Captain Keeley of the Golden Gate Park District Station. Similar demonstrations will be held at the same time in New York City, in Los Angeles, in London, and Amsterdam. Bring the color gold. Bring photos of personal saints and gurus and heroes of the underground. Bring children. Bring flowers, flutes, drums, feathers, bands, beads, flowers, flags, incense, chimes, gongs, cymbals, and joy. So, you know, very much a dispensation of the sort of, you know, the sort of iconography that they're pulling out. And to me, it's really compelling to understand that at this moment they're sort of, you know, seeing the importance of demonstrating, but they're not doing quite the same sorts of things that the radicals at Berkeley are doing. Instead, there's very much a sense of expressing humanity, that there's a sense that we bring music, we bring flowers, we bring our children, we bring joy, we bring something that is not just about showing up to fight, but we demonstrate something that is important about our common humanity. So, you know, the Diggers are really important figures, and they kind of they're gonna disappear in 1967, and we'll see why in a second. But, you know, one of the things that I think about with the Diggers is that they were very much conscious of the idea that they didn't want leaders. They didn't want anyone to know their name. They thought it was important that they not set up their group in a hierarchical way that sort of, you know, matched the other types of civil rights organizations or things like that. To them, it was really important that anyone could be a Digger just if they said so. And I think, you know, that points to something that I guess you would call horizontalism in today's politics, the notion that people were talking about at Occupy Wall Street and even Black Lives Matter. Who's the leader of Black Lives Matter? I know that there are leaders and there are figures that are within that movement, but it's not an organization in quite the same way as we would think of other left organizations in American history. So the Diggers are sort of along that road. They're very much, you know, using the dissolving boundaries of the LSD experience to see that they don't want to create an organization that has bosses and leaders, and they don't want to make this about one star, one cool guy that runs it all, and we all listen to him. They think everybody has to be involved. And so you can see, you know, they're talking about rent strikes, they're talking about housing, they're talking about food, and, you know, really the stuff of keeping people alive, and they're positing or wagering that human beings can create programs in which they sort of create their own stuff. So what happens? What happens to the movement? And this is something that, you know, is really the history that I think a lot of people know, which is that this is the history that you're going to see in your Ken Burns programs and your sort of like popular histories of American life and popular history of the 1960s, is something called the Summer of Love. So we're still in San Francisco. The Summer of Love happens in 1967. In part because the mass media has been projecting the images of the hippies. The media loves the Haight-Ashbury. By the time it's the late 1966, there are actually bus tours in San Francisco of the Haight-Ashbury. Tourists, old people, straight people, ordinary Americans are coming to San Francisco and signing up for the Haight-Ashbury bus tour, where they get to go through this neighborhood and see the hippies. And that is what's going to promote the Haight-Ashbury as this place where young people are hanging out and experiencing this new culture. And what happens is you get a gigantic influx of people into the Haight-Ashbury in 1967. In the summer of 1967, 75,000 young people come into San Francisco. So imagine 75,000 people showing up in downtown Los Angeles right now and saying, we're here to party. We're here. We heard the revolution was here. Let's do it. That ends up creating the bummer. And that bummer, by that, I mean, there are so many people and there is so much sort of energy on the streets in San Francisco during this period, that it's not the city isn't really able to handle this influx of young people. And the result is a lot of young people are going to end up homeless. And really, this is the world that Joan Didion writes about in her very famous essay, Slouching Toward Bethlehem, in which she came here to look at it. And she said, wow, there's a lot of delinquency going on here. And there's a lot of scary stuff, and a lot of people are getting just completely lost in this scene. So I don't want to get stuck on that, other than to say that a whole lot of people came to San Francisco in the summer of '67 because they were drawn there by the sense that the revolution was there, that's where the real action was. And they're not coming to the Berkeley campus. They're coming to Haight-Ashbury, right? And it's Jerry Rubin, who was one of the more, radical side of these things. When he saw the human being, after that day of seeing all those stoned kids at the human being, he thought to himself, and he said to others, we need to figure out how to get with that energy. That energy is important. And this is when you're going to start seeing all the politicos start growing their hair long, beards are going to come out, and you're going to really see, I think to ordinary Americans, by 1968, they're not going to be able to tell the difference between, a radical and an acid freak. They're not going to be able to tell the difference between those two things. It's all going to be one thing. And that's part of why the diggers are going to get out. So the diggers are going to get out, and they're going to actually have a funeral for hippies on October 6, 1967, a year after the death of LSD. They held a funeral for the hippie in the Haight-Ashbury district of this city. Hippie, devoted son of mass media. Friends are invited to attend services beginning at sunrise, October 6, 1967. And what they were doing was they were saying, look, the dream is dead because it got turned into a mass media television phenomenon. We now have tons of kids here who have no understanding of what we're trying to do, and they all just want to be part of a sort of cool, hip counterculture scene that they've been sold by television, because TV has been, at this point, covering the hippies nonstop, and a lot of young people are watching television, reading magazines, wanting to be there. So, I think it's pretty notable to look at the group, the diggers, who are basically declaring this whole scene is over in '67. And they're declaring it over because of the involvement of capitalism. I mean, they're essentially saying, like, look, we're trying to create an alternative city here. I mean, the Digger papers are now, they're hard to find, but the Digger papers are around. The Digger papers were like, they were a real manifesto. They were a real manifesto for how to create communal living, how to run a city without spending money on it. And it's something that, a lot of their ideas were just far out ideas. They're radical ideas. They seem, many of them might seem quaint to us today. But the fact that the Diggers as an organization were sort of, playing media, using the sense of theatricality in order to get people's attention, well, they got it. And the result is you're going to see it explode into the mainstream, but in a very sort of lifestyle way. So in other words, you're going to get a sort of notion by the Summer of Love that this is more about the music and the aesthetics and the style and the fun, rather than a sort of conscious creation of a new way of life. So that move from politics to lifestyle is something actually that the radicals feared would happen, and it did. So this is obviously really appealing stuff to young people. They want to be involved in it, but figures like the Diggers and the Black Panthers, the Black Panthers are, the question is, why didn't the Black Panthers get into the psychedelic revolution? Well, it's like, why didn't these groups really get together? Why wasn't it successful? The Black Panthers are sort of pulling from psychedelic ideas. They're more, anarchists. They're starting self-defense. They're starting free breakfast programs. And they definitely have the whole theater thing down, where they feel like they really need to be wild in order to get the attention of the press and play the press in some way. But the reality is, there never was a real synthesis between the people that were fighting for the Black people who were fighting for their own liberation in San Francisco and this community of psychedelic people who are going to ultimately like kind of swallow the Haight-Ashbury with this many people coming to the Summer of Love. So the Diggers are announcing that they're out of the game by the end of 1967. And one of the reasons that's going to be important is because at the same moment, you're going to see the Digger experiment kind of get ripped off. And it's going to get ripped off by people who are going to get a lot of attention. And who is that person? I mean, it's Abbie Hoffman. And Abbie Hoffman is a really important figure in American life. He's someone who many Americans, whether they're know anything about the counterculture or not, you might know Abbie Hoffman, right? And Abbie Hoffman is going to take a lot of the Diggers' ideas and sort of explode them into the mainstream. You can see like what a big figure Hoffman was. He took his own life in 1989. And you know, the fact that in 1989, People magazine, the celebrity magazine, would have Abbie Hoffman on the cover as Death of a Radical, it tells you a little bit of kind of how important Abbie Hoffman was. Abbie Hoffman is someone who's going to, you know, he's going to be turned on by LSD. He's a pretty, of all these counterculture guys, Hoffman is someone who never really got rid of his radicalism. He was a real, like, you know, straight leftist Marxist radical who got his mind blown by LSD, and he began thinking about the media. He began specifically thinking about how to, you know, use fake news and plant pranks and ideas and really take the capitalist media and use it against them. So that was a lot of his thoughts. He also wrote a book called Steal This Book. He wrote a number of books, but Steal This Book was a book that was meant to really express the values of the counterculture, in particular, the idea or notion of free. So he sort of is taking the free digger thing and saying, you know, here's a guide to living for free in the city. One of the Diggers is actually going to be mad about this. Peter Coyote, who's one of the Diggers whose names we actually know, he says later about Abbie, he says, Abbie Hoffman, who was a friend of mine, was always a media junkie. We explained everything to those guys, and they violated everything we taught them. Abbie went back, and the first thing he did was publish a book with his picture on it that blew the hustle of every poor person on the Lower East Side by describing every free scam then currently available in New York City, which were then sucked dry by disaffected kids from the suburbs. So, you know, this idea that, thanks a lot, Abbie. You took our free idea, which was about all of us building something together, and you violated the principles of the Diggers by becoming a huge star, making it all about you. And you know, the stuff that Hoffman did created a lot of attention, is actually going to make its way into the anti-war movement. So here's Abbie Hoffman at the New York Stock Exchange. He went in there and set fire to some money, literally, you know, U.S. cash. And burning money at the New York Stock Exchange was something that caught a lot of attention among other radicals who felt that that Abbie Hoffman was doing something so wild that they had to get their again, like, that energy, because he was so good at playing the media. These guys were a little nuts. Here's Jerry Rubin. Rubin, that, you know, was a stockbroker in the 80s, wears a suit and becomes a, you know, 100% capitalist. But here he is in the 1960s, a small picture, so it's blurring out. I'm going to make it a little bit smaller. But, you know, these guys like to get toy guns and dress up as mercenaries and do all sorts of pranks in public where they scared people, freaked people out. The point was to sort of put people through an experience like LSD by creating a guerrilla theater event. So they're doing lots of stuff like that. And in 67, they're going to capture the imagination of a number of straight political people, particularly Dave Dellinger. I don't have a picture of Dellinger, but Dave Dellinger is organizing a massive rally. It ends up being one of the biggest anti-war marches of the entire era. This is in October of 1967. And this is the March on the Pentagon. And they wanted Abbie Hoffman to be a part of it because they thought that he could somehow add and bring a particular sort of energy, and he could bring young people in. So what does Hoffman do, and what does he come up with for this event? I mean, Hoffman basically promoted the October 1967 Pentagon event as an exorcism. And he said that they were going to exorcise the Pentagon of its demonic energy. And I've got a little bit of of what happened at the Lincoln Memorial, and then and the people that then leave and go to the Pentagon. So it's this is from a book which I will share, Acid Dreams. 75,000 protesters assembled at the Lincoln Memorial, including a sizable number of hippie types dressed in colorful costumes. The motley army of witches, warlocks, sorcerers, and long-haired bards who had come to celebrate the mystic revolution lent a carnival atmosphere to the demonstration. After a rousing prelude of speeches and songs, a large contingent crossed the Arlington Memorial Bridge into Virginia and raced toward the Pentagon, waving banners, shouting anti-war epithets. Some were high on acid when they stormed the Pentagon. They surrounded the entire building, dancing and hissing in unison, while soldiers stood guard at all 5 walls. Posters and slogans memorializing Che Guevara, the Latin revolutionary who had been killed in Bolivia a few weeks earlier, appeared on abutments, and a Viet Cong flag, blue and red with a gold star, fluttered in a breeze. And then the promised exorcism began. Out, demons, out, boomed the voice of Ed Sanders, leader of a burlesque folk rock ensemble called the Fugs, which provided musical edification of the anti-war constituency. On a flatbed truck in front of the High Church of the Military-Industrial Complex, the Fugs worked their gene-shredding influence on the crowd. Thousands shrieked their approval, out, 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 and the stage was set for an ecstatic confrontation. You know, this event has been written about a lot. Norman Mailer, who's one of the sort of obnoxious, kind of narcissistic male writers of the 1960s, he wrote about this very famously in his book, Armies of the Night, in which, you know, he described this scene in the same way that Joan Didion did. He's looking at it like from a elite literary person, but he's also sees himself as sympathetic to the movement. And he's like, what is going on here? These are the freaks. And the freaks that are trying to, the point of what they were trying to do was to levitate the Pentagon. And they wanted to levitate it and turn it into a kind of spirit of gold and light. There was a lot, these people were very high. And so, what they were trying to do was sort of, internalize these magical concepts, but really, it was theater. And that part of it was important, but the other part of this is that the Pentagon defended the Pentagon violently. And, there had been a plan. Part of Abbie Hoffman's plan was to get millions and millions of flowers, and they had a pilot, and they were going to have a pilot in a Cessna fly over the Pentagon and rain millions of flowers upon the Pentagon. That was the plan. They didn't do it because J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI actually cracked them and actually stopped them from doing that. But they did get the flowers. And what ended up happening is the flowers were everywhere. And all of a sudden you had flowers all over the place at the Pentagon with the people doing these rituals. And that ended up creating some of the most important, and I think maybe electric images of the 1960s were the image of very stoned looking people standing in front of the National Guard, placing these flowers inside the barrels of the National Guard and military police rifles. So that image, and there's an extraordinary set of them in which you have these many women kind of approaching and sort of offering these flowers. It created an iconic image. I should say that this happened earlier this week. I saw a viral video of a protester at Black Lives Matter approaching the police and giving them the flower, and they tackled her and arrested her. So I don't know if this always works, and I don't know if this is a different period or whatever, but I'll say that, this very much captures the spirit of the generation and very much captures the sort of sense that, there's a confrontation happening here, and there's a confrontation happening that might be between a sort of, nature versus mechanic, nature versus industrial society. There's a lot of different ways of kind of squaring that, but this image is one that I think is worth thinking about because it really captures how deep this generational schism really went. So I want to just give one last kind of story of how this sort of story wraps up. And it's a dark one in some ways, but at the same time, I think it points a little bit to this stuff about Seattle, the stuff about Occupy, the politics of our age, in which there's, the hippies of this era, they were influenced and informed, and often, it's not like they were like there was, you know, people that were just hippies and people that were just radicals. That existed, but there was a lot of people who would consider themselves both, right? It's like, I'm a hippie and a radical, right? I don't think of it as different. And People's Park is certainly something that kind of shows that. I think that one thing that the hippie generation, with their kind of, you know, melding of counterculture and politics, one of the things that comes out is this sort of kind of community action and doing things within the community that are service oriented. So People's Park was a moment in 1969 in which a whole lot of people, and I would say there wasn't a particular group. These are people from the community. These are people from Berkeley, students from Berkeley, and counterculture people from all over the place are going to occupy a piece of land that's owned by the University of California. And that piece of land is going to be called People's Park. It was a piece of land that they weren't using, that Berkeley said they were going to eventually build a gymnasium on. It's actually interesting because it kind of corresponds with the fight at Columbia University for the gymnasium, or against the gymnasium in '68. But in either case, you know, the People's Park thing, people started building this park. They said, you know what, the university's not using this land. We're actually going to use the same logic that the white Californians that settled this place, or the white colonizers that settled this place took, which was that if you're using the land, it's yours. So we're going to say the community is using the land, and the community therefore owns the land. And People's Park is an example of this sort of community project. And over the course of months, People's Park was turned into this place where people were building things. They were building gardens, they were building playgrounds, they were building places where people could, you know, find a sort of community. And this is a great color picture of People's Park here. And it was, you know, something that was meant to, I think, not just be a physical place. It wasn't just about building a park. It was about demonstrating that we as people could come together to create something together, and that it could be a positive thing. And it was especially important after all the losses, all the being wiped out by the police in Berkeley. This is after a number of really ugly uprisings in Berkeley in which the police just beat the shit out of radicals and counterculture people in San Francisco and Berkeley. So it was really important for them to express this kind of community coming together. And you had men, women, poor people, Black people, you know, a diverse group of people who are working to create this place. I love this picture because it's so obviously a person from the community. Go see People's Park, then you won't let them destroy this lovely creative thing. Because there's going to be a fight for People's Park. And you can imagine that the university at some point is going to announce that you are no longer allowed to be there. And ultimately that's going to create the fight. So I just want to get these facts correct that I'm giving you here, because what happens is pretty extraordinary. At some point during all of this, and I should say during all of this, I mean the LSD explosion that's happening in San Francisco and the political actions sort of emerging out of it, Ronald Reagan becomes governor of California. And Ronald Reagan becomes governor of California because he is really playing up the mad Berkeley, and he's going to do something about it. So he's really playing up a lot of fears that older people have, young people are being lost, and that he's going to reestablish law and order. So he's going to use People's Park as a sort of demonstration of his strength. And People's Park is going to be attacked, and I want to get the date right. Here's the announcement of the park itself from the builders of it. They say, "We are building a park on the land. We will take care of it and guard it. When the university comes with its land title, we'll tell them, your land title's covered in blood. We won't touch it. Your people ripped off the land from Indians a long time ago. If you want it back now, you'll have to fight for it again." So Ronald Reagan takes that call to fight seriously. And at 4:30 in the morning, and this will kind of, I mean, I'll give my prediction here. I think this is coming for Seattle. It already came for a number of other places, and it definitely came for Occupy Wall Street in the middle of the night. There's an image of Ray Kelly, the police chief of the NYPD, walking through, buttoning his, kind of straightening his shirt, looking like a pure jackbooted fascist in Occupy Wall Street in Zuccotti Park after they eliminated everyone from there violently. But at 4:30 in the morning, on May 15th, 1969, 250 California Highway Patrol officers surrounded the park with bulldozers and destroyed weeks of construction. By noon that day, everyone heard that the police were taking it apart, and 6,000 people, community activists, hippies, radicals, young people, maybe this woman was there, not sure. 6,000 of them showed up to fight the cops, and they fought the cops. And the police officers, for reasons we still do not know, opened fire on the crowd with shotguns. And they opened fire on the crowd with shotguns that were supposed to be filled with bird shot, which is shot that's a little softer and smaller so it doesn't kill you. Instead, for reasons that are still unknown, the Highway Patrol shotguns that day were loaded with buckshot, meant to kill deer. So the result of that was that 128 unarmed civilians were sprayed by shotgun fire. So 128 civilians were shot. One, James Rector, a Berkeley student, 21 years old, was killed. So this is like a Kent State, and it's about this park, and it's over the very concept of our ability to take a piece of land and do something with it, right? So many people left Berkeley after this happened. This was kind of the end of things. I mean, Frank Bardak, who was the person who was really one of the main radicals and faces of People's Park, they knew who he was. And from Frank's description of what happened to him, the police, when they got a hold of him, put him on his knees, cocked a gun and put it to his temple and forced him to sing the Star-Spangled Banner. So, this event ends with the police. And I think that it's important to note that it ends with the police, it ends with police violence at People's Park. But this whole movement, this whole particular flash of LSD politics that I've been describing to you, and it looks like it's almost time to wrap up. This whole flash of LSD politics that happened in the 1960s was tied directly and often, specifically to events that were happening between the Black community and police departments across the United States. So the idea that police departments and the Black community have this historically horrific relationship, a very unequal relationship in which the police are attacking the Black community, and the flashes of fighting against that. There's also this, this sort of like white radical movement that's looking at things like that and wondering, how do we become a part of that? And in the 1960s, we got a really close example of what happened. You had a sort of synthesis between Black radicals and the psychedelic community, in the sense that they were all concerned with how to create institutions that would counter the oppressive, dominant institutions of capitalism and the state. So, I really see the acid politics. Again, I'm giving you a very, very small part of this story because I really wanted to drill down into this notion of like anarchism. And I'm really interested in the fact that there's this sort of free community that's been built in Seattle. At the same time, there's these racial fights. It's something worth thinking about. I'm going to look at Diana's question here, because it's been hanging here for a while. The general attitude towards drugs in the 50s and 60s, hard to imagine something like acid being legal these days, given how hard to push to decriminalize marijuana has been. What was the messaging about drug use? That's a great question.
Yeah. Hi,
yeah.
I was first going to ask a question. I guess like another contextual piece is like, I'm also thinking about like what, like pre-Nixon's war on drugs in like the late 60s and early 70s, like what did people think about drug use? Because you were also saying at the beginning, like it was used psychiatrically. So I'm just like, did people view it as a demonic thing, or was it,
It's a great question. I mean, I think it's hard to generalize like what people thought, because it would depend on where they are and who where they're coming from. I mean, there was a certain level of hysteria about marijuana use in the 50s. That was the era of all the, the movies and other kind of bits of culture that sort of saw marijuana as this great menace. It's interesting because you even see it in the Cary Grant thing, the way the tabloid sort of says like, LSD, like Cary Grant doing something wild there. I mean, I think drug use, particularly recreational drug use, has never really been fully accepted socially or legally in American life, despite the fact that, you know, certain drugs, right? I mean, caffeine, nicotine, alcohol, we have certain drugs, the drugs that tend to sort of fit into capitalism, I would say. Coffee breaks and cigarette breaks are written into labor laws. There's a lot of interesting stuff there when it comes to substances. But yeah, I mean, the drug thing is something that I think there was a lot of hysteria about, and it's weird because you don't get a lot of like, you only get a lot of like cultural expressions of like heroin. Like you don't say heroin magazine, you know, and like, oh, let's do heroin, and like it's like a political thing. But because LSD and marijuana seem to have some social or political sort of cast to them, at least the way they played out in the United States, that's why, I mean, you may know this history. You mentioned Nixon and the war on drugs, right? I mean, it's really, really famous now that we know that the war on drugs was a way for the Nixon administration to target two groups. And the two groups that they said were the most dangerous groups in America. Who were they? White radicals, specifically like the Weather Underground type, who are totally LSD radicals, and black radicals, right? They saw those two groups as posing the biggest threat to American society. And the drug issue was a way to go after both of them, right? It's like we could go after, I mean, we have letters now, J. Edgar Hoover, in which he, declassified it, in which he's saying, these people are all smoking pot. All you have to do is make marijuana super illegal, and we can wipe the white radicals out. And then with the blacks, we'll go after other drugs, you know, heroin specifically at the time. But ultimately, you know, you may know that there's a story of CIA and crack cocaine in the 80s as well. So drug policy and how it connects to this sort of sense that there's a way to placate radical communities or even create laws that will allow us to arrest them en masse. That's really the end point of the 1960s. And I really think of Nixon as kind of following in Reagan's footsteps. And there's a lot of interaction between those two because they're both vying for president or for a position within the Republican Party. But yeah, that's a really, really great point. And I have a couple other quick things that I just want to mention really quickly. The People's Park fight is really fascinating. The idea that there was at one point, here's more evidence that there was an attempt to sort of meld the world of the black radicals and the white radicals and create a sort of hybrid yippie Panther pipe dream, they called it. And I definitely want to look at that Berkeley Barb and see the rest of this. But, another quick legacy I could say is that LSD, it's culturally influential. And one of the things that I think of when I think of LSD and like black psychedelia, which is something that, there's got to be a lot of work done on psychedelia. The story that we've told again and again has been this Tim Leary story. There's so much more going on to it. There's so much more we don't know. But groups like, when I think of black radical or black psychedelia, I think of groups like Sly and the Family Stone, who were sort of breaking down racial barriers. They had a white drummer. I mean, all sorts of, weird stuff in Sly and the Family Stone, or George Clinton and Parliament Funkadelic, who are sort of like, melding and breaking down boundaries between musical styles and between types of people in the band. There's a lot going on where the influence and legacy of psychedelia in black culture is not so much about, Black Panthers taking acid, although that happened, and there's certainly evidence of that. It's more that you see evidence of LSD in the arts, and you see music change. Like I was just reading this biography of John Coltrane. Coltrane's music was weird in the 60s, and everyone said he must be taking acid, and there's a lot of evidence that says he was. So, where does this all end? Where does this leave us? It ends with 2020, in which, Gwyneth Paltrow, who is a person who is, created this thing called Goop Lab. It's kind of crazy because she's promoting the use of psychedelics, particularly LSD and psilocybin mushrooms, but it's being promoted in a different context. It's a totally different. I don't think Gwyneth Paltrow is saying like, sell all your possessions and let's start an anarchist community in the middle of our city. Instead, it's sort of a lifestyle thing. It's sort of a way to break down certain ideas and assumptions within the human mind. Ayelet Waldman, A Really Good Day. This book is a big New York Times bestseller just a couple years ago. How microdosing made a mega difference in my mood, my marriage, and my life. So, in a lot of ways, there's this industry right now that's saying psychedelics can actually adjust you to the experience of living in capitalism, and make it something that that is very different from the legacy of LSD in the 60s, which was about using these drugs to decondition people from those fundamental values. So it's really, really an interesting thing. And I would just mention this book is where a lot of the stuff I talked about today is from the Complete Social History of LSD by Martin Lee and Bruce Schlain. There's another great book that I would recommend if you're interested in the political end of this, Storming Heaven, LSD and the American Dream. And there's a lot more out there. But I just wanted to thank, I know we're a little bit over time, I just want to thank everybody. I had a really good time talking about this stuff. And I think that, you know, as we're moving forward through whatever revolutionary moment we may or may not be in right now, it's worth thinking about the way that different groups in the 1960s were sort of organizing this stuff, and we're trying to figure it out, because I do think there is evolution, and there is evolution since this period, but this is a really, really important period. So thank you. I hope you enjoyed my acid stories. So much more, but I think I'll leave it there. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Jeremiah. Thank you, Diana. I had a really good time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Justin.
We can feel them. You can raise your hand on the participants button, or just shout them out. Unmute yourself.
Thank you.
Thank you. Had a good time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eliza. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Matt. Good to see you all, even if you were hidden.
Hey, David. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So I was at the first half, I believe, of your Big Lebowski talk. So I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about the connection between sort of how those characters basically became, mainly the dude, like, came out of this movement and basically lost, right? So it sounds like the park incident was sort of kind of maybe the nail in the coffin or something like that. So just kind of connecting those characters and like how they came out of this movement and kind of lost to capitalism, unfortunately.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. I mean, there's sort of a tragedy to the dude in a lot of ways, the kind of hippie burnout character. I think that the Coen brothers located a lot of comedy in that figure, you know, and we typically think of it as a funny thing. And I mean, I think at some point he even says, you know, what he likes to do with his time is, I like to drive around, bowl, and the occasional acid flashback. So, you know, you're like, you know, they're kind of keying into the dude as a LSD figure. But yeah, I think you're right. I think that the counterculture, the hippie counterculture of the 60s, you know, I put an end point on it with People's Park, but it doesn't really have an end. All these people went on, and they're sort of like, you know, became people in their 30s, and became people in their 40s, and became people in their 50s. And how old's the dude supposed to be? I assume in his early 40s, right? Something like that. But either way, there's this sense that the action all happened back then, and it's sad. It is a loss. I mean, the Abbie Hoffman story is a tragedy, in part because in 1989 he killed himself, in part after a period of depression in which he was looking at Reagan and the conservative backlash and everything that happened, particularly with young people not being as active anymore. He felt like he was one of those guys who just couldn't get over it. He was like, what happened? 20 years ago, I was burning money on the New York Stock Exchange and had tens of thousands of young people cheering me on. We were going to crush capitalism. We were going to create a new society, but it didn't go that way. And instead, like a lot of people, including Jerry Rubin, his partner, put on a suit and went and sold out and got, you know, made himself a millionaire.
I really like the quote that you said about the Big Lebowski, who says, your revolution is over. Yeah, your revolution is over. The bums lost. Yeah. It's an important thing. Yeah, thank you, Alec. That's a good question. All right, I think everyone's left. They all still, oh wait, there's a few more people here. Oh, you know what? I'm looking at the wrong thing. Everyone, you're still here. Hi, everyone.
We've got some people. Anybody else with another question, or?
John.
Oh, we got John here.
Yes.
Go ahead.
So I don't necessarily have a question, but I just want to say I'm a person of that generation. I'm also David's dad, but you know, I really think you got it right. It was great
Oh, good.
to listen
Thank
to
you.
that. I mean, I'm 74 years old now, and I see what's going on now, and I have my reactions to it. But to see you present what was going on in the 60s and 70s and just really capture it, it made me feel good. So thank you for doing that. And,
Thanks so much. That means that just means I read the right books. But thank you, John. I mean, that's really good to hear, because I was not there for it.
Do you you know Pacifica Radio and WBAI from that era?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So like I would be glued to my radio listening to Abbie Hoffman and Jerry
Oh,
Rubin
wow.
and Tim.
Yep.
You know, they would just come on and they would do, and these guys were really smart, interesting people, sometimes a little crazy, but they were, it was a very textured time, so many different themes, and you got all of them, you know? Just,
thank you. Thanks you, John.
It wasn't just about taking drugs. So
no, it wasn't. I mean, at some point, maybe it came that for some people, but there was a real politics to this, for sure.
Totally. And you could be in both places at the same time.
Yeah.
But some people, you know. Okay, but thanks.
Thank you, John.
And you know, it was good to remember the be-in and the stuff at the Pentagon. I'd kind of forgotten those things. But,
cool.
All right. See you guys.
You, John.
Fun note to end on, but does anybody have something?
I just want to say hi to Al. Hey, Al.
Hey, David. I was actually going to say something.
Yeah.
So do you have any thoughts on how the whole LSD movement kind of connects to the tech nightmare that we live today?
You know what?
Jobs and
you just gave me the idea for the next Olio, which would be about Silicon Valley and LSD and all that, because you know it's one thing I didn't get into, but a lot of that theatrical stuff and media, like using the media, and especially Ken Kesey's like experiments with audio recording and video recording, it seems like it anticipates the whole era in a lot of ways. They were like, these guys were content makers, you know, and if they were around today, I think they would be very much engaging in the tech stuff, but maybe they wouldn't. I don't know. I think that so much has happened with tech, you know, getting away from the utopian promises of tech that were in the 60s and 70s, and how we all see tech now as tied directly to all the worst elements of capitalism. And, you know, I think I'm interested in what movements will happen around tech moving forward. Will there be a generation of young people who sort of like forswear it and are like, well, we don't use phones at all, and that's like not cool. I don't know about that, but it's a great question, Al. I mean, it's a big topic, because it's like,
yeah, I mean, it seems like it kind of mirrors the whole thing of you know, how it starts off as anti-capitalist and then kind of gets consumed by it, and basically the capitalists end up being, you know, guys that took LSD.
Yeah.
But in the opposite direction.
Yeah, it's kind of scary. I mean, capitalism can absorb and eat anything, even acid, which is something pretty intense to think about. And I think that's part of what, you know, has to be written into whatever protest movements are happening today, is like these lessons. Is like, you know, those diggers, when they saw the Summer of Love and those 75,000 people coming, they were like, oh shit, it's over. This has become a media thing. We lost control of it. I mean, maybe it's hard to keep things, you have to keep things small to keep them pure. I don't know. But there are a lot of thoughts there and a lot of ideas that I think people should be grappling with one way or the other, for sure.
Well, thanks a lot for that.
Yeah,
man.
thank you, Al.
Thanks so much, David.
Yeah.
I think that does it for tonight. That's perfect. Thanks everyone for coming. We'll talk to David about the next one, and we'll be sure to let you all know. But thank you all so much for being here, and I hope you have a nice night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris and David. Good night, everyone.
Thanks, David.
Good night, Chris and David and everybody.
Good night, John.
Night, John.
Great to see you.
Hey.